Hey guys, and welcome back to another Mystery Monday video on my channel. Today's video is going to be a video that I've actually previously done in the past. When I first started my YouTube channel, it was actually the first video that I ever posted. So if you've been on this channel for a very long time, then you've probably seen that video. But I'm redoing it because it is my pet case, and since I have gotten better at making videos and gathering information, I just really wanted to do this one again. So I hope that you guys can still enjoy it even though I did already do it. But with that all being said, let's get right into today's video. Brandon Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989 to his two parents, Annette and Brian Swanson. Brandon had remained really close to his parents throughout his whole entire life and was described as being a generally really well-behaved kid. He'd never been in trouble and was just overall a really good kid. At this time, Brandon was 19 years old and was attending school at Minnesota's West Community College in Canby, Minnesota. I hope I'm pronouncing the name of that city correctly. He was enrolled in a wind turbine program and would actually drive from Marshall, Minnesota, where he lived with his two parents, to Canby, Minnesota, every single day to attend school. But he was actually planning on switching schools come August and would eventually go on to a career in sciences. Tuesday, May 14th, 2008 was actually Brandon's last day of school. So being a normal 19-year-old, him and some of his friends had decided to go out and celebrate. Now, this information varies depending on the article that you read, but some say that Brandon had started drinking at the beginning of the night, and by the time he had left, the party was completely sober, and others say that he continuously drank throughout the whole entire night. But I'll talk about that a little bit more closer to the end of this video. Brandon had decided to leave his friends between 12 and 12:30 p.m. to head home to his house in Marshall, Minnesota. But on the way home, he had driven off of the gravel road into a ditch. His car had actually become stuck because his tires were slightly lifted off the ground, so he couldn't get traction enough to get the car to actually move. So he was completely stuck on this very deserted gravel road in the middle of the night. After realizing he was stuck and that there was no way that he was going to get out of this on his own, he decided to call some of his friends that he had been with earlier that night. But none of them had answered, so that left him with the only option of calling his parents. When he called his parents, he asked them to pick him up, and he told them he knew exactly where he was. He said he was just outside of the town of Lind, which was a small town just southwest of Marshall. And it was actually, I think, very, very close to Marshall, Minnesota, but he was absolutely adamant he knew exactly where he was. Because Brandon had seemed to have thought that he was in a very specific spot, when Annette and Brian had left their house to go and find Brandon, they didn't think that they would have any trouble tracking him down. But when they arrived at the spot that Brandon had said he was absolutely nowhere to be found. They couldn't see him anywhere. At this point, Brandon was now again on the phone with his parents, so Annette told him that they would start flashing their headlights to see if he could see them. And at this time, Brandon had also begun flashing his headlights as well, but they could not see each other, so they couldn't have been within range of seeing where each other were because they couldn't see each other's headlights. And they were both flashing them and flashing them and flashing them and growing more and more frustrated at the fact that they couldn't find each other. In fact, at this point, Brandon had gotten so frustrated at his parents that him and his mom had gotten into some sort of a little bit of an argument, and he had actually hung up on her, and she had to call him back to apologize because they were both so extremely frustrated with the situation. Now, this part in this case isn't verified, and you're going to see throughout a lot of this case there are little things that I think personally are probably important in this case and are not verified and not confirmed online, but this is just the start of one of them. It is said in some places that after this, Brian had actually drove Annette home and dropped her off while he went out and continued to look for Brandon. It was now sometime between 1:30 and 2 a.m., and Brian had been driving around looking for his son for almost an hour, but the two had remained on the phone, so Brandon was still on the phone with his dad at this point. And Brandon had actually said to his dad that he could see the lights from the town of Lind, so he was going to walk towards them and meet his dad at a popular plaza in the town. Shortly after 2 a.m., while Brian was still trying to locate Brandon and Brandon was still trying to walk to the town of Lind on foot, Brian heard something very, very horrifying on the other end of the line. Brandon yelled, "Oh shit." And this part of the case isn't confirmed again, but either the line went dead or Brian just completely lost Brandon and he was still on the phone, but he couldn't hear anything. I'm more inclined to believe in this case that at this point the line went dead, and the reason for that is because I actually watched an interview with Brian Swanson, and he was saying that after the line had cut out, he had tried to call Brandon back multiple times without any luck. There was never another answer on the end of the line. And if he hadn't lost complete connection to Brandon's phone, then he most likely would have heard something after Brandon yelled the profanity. If Annette had been dropped off earlier in the night, then she was now back out with Brian looking all over the place for their son. They frantically looked for him and notified the police at around 6:30 a.m. When police were notified, they'd actually said that because Brandon was 19 years old, he was an adult, and if he wanted to go missing or stay out the whole entire night without letting his parents know where he was, then that was up to him and there was nothing they could do about it. These types of situations where police refuse to look for somebody because they're an adult and they think that they went missing on their own accord always bother me, but in this particular case, it really bothers me because he was on the phone with his dad. He was trying to get his dad to locate him, and then something happened to cause him to yell into the phone, and then that was just it. And now he's just out there missing in the wilderness or wherever he was, and the police think that he did this on purpose. I don't think that anybody in their right mind could have planned what would have happened. If he was planning on going out and spending the night out without letting his parents know, wouldn't he have just stayed at the party or gone, to one of his friends' houses? This really enrages me, this whole situation. This is something that drives me absolutely nuts in this case. And it does drive me nuts in other cases, but in this one in particular, nobody does this on their own accord. When police did finally decide to help look for Brandon, they decided to pull his phone records to try and track down exactly where he was to try and locate his vehicle. Strangely enough, Brandon's car was actually located 25 miles away from where Brandon had originally thought that he was. And his car was located in between the towns of Taunton and Porter. And even more strange, when they had found his vehicle, all 4 car doors were completely open. And this again isn't verified, but it is stated in some places that a weed pipe was found inside the vehicle. It is at this point that they also realized that Brandon hadn't actually driven into a ditch, but he had driven on some mud, and I guess his car had slid and lost traction, and that is why he became stuck, but there was absolutely no damage to his vehicle. Investigators said that after seeing the scene of the crash, or the place where Brandon's car got stuck, they didn't think that Brandon was intoxicated. And Brian had actually said that while he was on the phone with his son, he seemed completely sober. But the people who Brandon had actually been with earlier that evening couldn't agree on whether he was drunk when he left the party or not. Some of his friends that said that he had actually started drinking at the beginning of the night, and by the time he had left to go home, he was completely sober. And other people who were at the party said that he was consistently drinking the whole entire night and could have very well been intoxicated when he left the party. Now, this is something strange that I had actually seen on Web Sleuths, but it was said that when the police and Brandon's parents were calling his phone over and over again on both Wednesday and Thursday, the calls were going through, they were ringing, and then they would eventually go to voicemail after the call was over, like, when you call a phone and it rings and rings and rings and then goes to voicemail. That was happening up until late Thursday afternoon, and then the phone calls just started to go straight to voicemail, meaning that the phone presumably died. So if the phone wasn't dead or completely out of service when Brandon had yelled into the phone when he was on the phone with his dad, then why had the call cut out? The original theory in this case was that Brandon had somehow fallen into the Yellow Medicine River and drowned. On the night that Brandon had gone missing, the water was 15 feet deep and was flowing extremely rapidly, so it would have been very easy for him to have fallen in the water and become disoriented. Numerous searches of both the river and the area around the river, around where Brandon's truck was found, have been conducted, but unfortunately nothing of Brandon's has ever turned up. And investigators have now stated that they believe that if Brandon had fallen into the river, then some kind of evidence would have shown up by now. Another theory in this case that I kind of talked about a little bit already and told you my feelings on is that Brandon vanished on his own accord. And again, I just really don't agree with this theory. I think that if Brandon wanted to vanish, there are so many easier ways that he could have done it than by doing this, and I don't think that any of this could have been premeditated. But a lot of people do think that this is possible, and this is actually a very popular theory, so I just thought that I would mention it briefly. It is also a possibility that Brandon had fallen and hit his head, and maybe this could have possibly caused him to get amnesia, and now he's living out his life somewhere else and he has no idea who he is. In this case, there actually hasn't been any calls of sightings of seeing Brandon anywhere, but this is probably the most comforting theory in this case, and it is the one that I personally hope is what happened compared to the other theories that something much worse had happened to Brandon on that night. Others believe that Brandon could have actually very well have yelled because he did slip into the river, but maybe he had gotten out, and after he had gotten out of the river, he was completely soaked, and on this night, it was absolutely freezing. I think in Minnesota, it was only 3 degrees that night. So it was very possible that he would be so cold. And maybe he was walking around and found an abandoned building and seeks shelter in there. And maybe this building has never been checked, or maybe it was demolished, and that is why Brandon's remains have never been discovered. Other people have speculated that Brandon could have possibly fallen into a well or been attacked by an animal. But again, these two theories aren't ones that I personally think are what happened, because I think that if Brandon was attacked by an animal, it is more likely that his parents would have heard more than a yell on the phone, and there would have been no reasonable explanation as to why the phone would have cut out. Also, people who are usually attacked by animals leave behind blood, clothes, hair, something. And in this case, there was absolutely no evidence of an animal attack or anything of the sort. And if he fell into a well, then they most likely would have found his body, unless they haven't checked that well yet. This next theory is actually one that I came across on Reddit, and I thought that it was a very, very interesting one. And that is that maybe Brandon had stumbled into a crop and fallen asleep, and the farmer, not expecting there to be a teenage boy sleeping in his crops, came out the next morning to do his farming and maybe ran Brandon over with some kind of farm machinery. And maybe after seeing what he had done and realizing that it was maybe too late to help Brandon, maybe this farmer wanted to keep his name clear and wanted to avoid police investigation on his property, so he just disposed of any evidence. This again is unverified, but on the same subreddit, somebody had actually posted that in the investigation, the sniffer dogs had actually picked up Brandon's scent on some kind of heavy farm machinery. And the farmer who had owned the machinery was very reluctant to let investigators search his property. It is very possible that if sniffer dogs had picked up Brandon's scent on some kind of machinery, that this farmer just didn't want a million investigators stomping all over his crops. But in this theory, I also think that it is possible that there is some truth to it. Something else in this case that is very strange is that Brandon Swanson's name is actually on the American VCAP list. And that usually means that authorities believe that whoever is on that list has somehow met foul play. And this leads me to my next theory, which is that maybe Brandon possibly had drug dealers after him. And I think this theory mostly accumulated because of the fact that a weed pipe was found in Brandon's vehicle, but there could possibly be some truth to it, just like all of the other theories in this case. People had speculated that maybe Brandon did owe these drug dealers big money, and maybe they had been following him, and that is why he didn't take the highway home and he had actually ended up taking the back roads. And that would also kind of give an explanation as to why all 4 of his car doors were open. Maybe they were ransacking his vehicle trying to find something. But again, if that was the case, Brandon was out walking trying to find his dad for almost 2 hours. So why would the drug dealers track him down for almost 2 hours and not attack him until that minute? What were they waiting for, if that is the case? And again, Brandon was described as being an extremely well-behaved kid. He'd never had any run-ins with the law, and he was extremely close to his parents. So this theory just leaves me with more questions. And although Brandon is on the VCAP list, authorities deny that they believe that foul play was involved. This again, like I said at the beginning of this video, is one of my pet cases. This is actually the case that got me into missing persons cases, because this one just leaves me so puzzled. I have so many questions. Why didn't Brandon take the highway home that night? If he had seen city lights while he was on the phone with his dad, why after he had gotten off the phone or the phone disconnected, didn't he continue to walk towards that town? And if he did he meet foul play in the town? There is just so many unanswered questions in this case, and that is why this is one of the cases that I just keep going back to over and over again. One good thing that came out of this case is actually that Brandon's law is now in effect in Minnesota. And this law requires law enforcement to search for anybody as soon as they are reported missing, regardless of their age. My heart sincerely goes out to Annette and Brian Swanson and all of Brandon's other loved ones and family and friends and just anybody who knew him. This is such a hard case to cover because he was so close to being home. If he had just taken the highway that night, and if so many other things had just fallen into place the way that they were supposed to, then Brandon wouldn't be missing to this day. So my condolences go out to the family and all of his friends and anybody who knew him, and I really hope that one of these days we can get answers for this case. And guys, that brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss another video from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!